Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second in our East Asian history episodes. Today, we're going to talk about Qin Shi Huangdi, and my pronunciation is probably going to be horrible um, in terms of the tone. So let's bear in mind with that. But the rules for those who are not familiar: this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing tonight. This is a secular presentation, by which I mean I'm going to try and stand outside of the politics of any particular side or position and try to do this from as neutral a perspective as possible. I also like to say that I follow Will Wheaton's law of being respectful, right? Don't be a dick. If you need to have that explained, that's probably too far down the wrong track. But I do love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning a 101 if you don't know anything, I'll try and catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably still tell you something you didn't know. I also have a 2 hour hard stop, so if we don't get to all the slides tonight, that's okay. In 2 weeks, when we pick up, uh, it'll be 2 weeks on Thursday, so it's 13 days from today. Uh, but at that point, we'll pick up the remaining slides and continue into our next session, which will be on the beginning, if not the completion, of the Han Dynasty. When I put dates below a person, that's typically their years of service, if they're a political figure, and if they're a philosopher or other thought leader that doesn't have an exact tenure, it's their years of life. This is going to be recorded, so you can watch it later. And in fact, it'll be on our YouTube channel. I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all of the different shows and presentations that we put out. And if you want to be here in the live Zoom so you can ask your questions and get real answers, please join our meetup to be alerted to when those next presentations are. And of course, we will continue to do this for free, but we really do appreciate that if you think that we're doing a great job, that you help us keep the lights on. So our PayPal and buy a coffee links are right there, and you can provide at your leisure. All right. So one of the things that we didn't really discuss last time, but that I thought was worth taking a moment to talk about, because it's going to be something that we're going to deal with throughout Chinese history and the history of this region more generally, is on the question of names and how we're going to use writing to describe what it is that we're seeing and doing in this region. So the first thing I want to point out is that Chinese individuals, especially in the pre-modern period, will have lots of different names. And those names are based on where they come from, the age they are, the rank they might have, and so on and so forth. So if we take somebody like Sun Yat-sen, and by the way, an important thing to remember with East Asian names is that the surname comes in the front. So Sun is actually his family name, and Yat-sen is his given name, even though it's said as Sun Yat-sen instead of Yat-sen Sun. So when it comes to him, we have a situation where we have a lot of different names. All of the names in that table are names that Sun Yat-sen had at some point in his life, right? So he had his birth name, and because he was a native Cantonese speaker, he had both a Mandarin pronunciation for his name, which was Sun Wen, and then he had a Cantonese pronunciation of the name, which is Xun Man, right? And then you have his genealogical name. This is the name that would have been recorded in the registrars when he was born. And then you have his milk name, which is the name that is given when a child is very young. And then you have a courtesy name, which is a name that people will use to address him in the middle of a conversation. And then in the case of Sun Yat-sen, because he was baptized as a Christian, he had a baptismal name. And of course, all of these names, because they were given in Chinese characters, and Chinese characters retain the meaning but not the pronunciation across different districts. Think about how numbers retain their meaning all across Europe, but may be pronounced differently in different places. And then he had his Western name, which of course is the Yat-sen that we're familiar with. And then of course, you have the name in modern China, where he's um, known as Sun Zhongshan. And in fact, if you talk to any Chinese individuals, that's the name that they'll recognize much more than Sun Yat-sen. But in order to keep things simple throughout this series, I'm going to use one name for any given person instead of using all the different names that they were known as through their life. And so it may be strange to call somebody by a name that they wouldn't have received yet, but let's take that in stride as an anachronism just to facilitate this process. Now, there are also points that we should make with regards to spelling. There are two major styles of writing Chinese and Latin characters. There are many more, but two main ones that prevail. One of them is what's called the Wade-Giles system, and it's an older system. It's primarily used in Taiwan, and names that were Romanized in the pre-communist period. And then you have the Pinyin system, which is the system currently used in the People's Republic of China. Now, for this series, I'm going to use the Pinyin system um, almost consistently to represent Mandarin pronunciation of certain time periods, simply because you have to choose some form of consistency, and Mandarin has more unique characters to represent unique sounds. And some of those sounds might be counterintuitive from the letters that are represented. I mean, for example, B, D, and M have the same sounds in Mandarin as they do in English. But the letter Q is a ch sound, the letter X is a x sound, the letter Z is a z sound, and the letter C is a ц sound. And ZH is j. So some of the letters do have different pronunciations, even though those pronunciations are consistent throughout the Pinyin system. There's a question about the baptismal and Western names with regards to Sun Yat-sen. Um, it's not a coincidence, of course, that the baptismal name and his Western name are the same. When he came to Hawaii, which is where he studied, because he was born in China, but he studied in Hawaii, which is where he picked up his ideas about Republican government. We're hopefully we'll eventually get to Sun Yat-sen. But he spent his time in Hawaii among other Christians, and so he was identified very much by that Christian identity. So that's really why his English name his Western name derives so much from his baptismal name. When it comes to Korean and Japanese, there is a general system of romanization. In Korean, it's called romaja, and in Japanese, it's called romaji. And that romanization is what I'll use consistently to represent those names. When it comes to Mongolian inside the Republic of Mongolia is written with Cyrillic script, just like Russian. Although, of course, linguistically, it's not related at all to Russian, but the same way that you can write Filipino with Latin letters, even though it's not related at all to Latin, or Hungarian in Latin letters, even though it's not in any way related to Latin. You can write Mongolian in Cyrillic, even though it's not related to Russian in any way. And of course, the older style of writing Mongolian, which is vertical, is actually still used in the Chinese controlled regions where there are Mongolian populations, such as Inner Mongolia. The hardest one actually to render in English spelling in terms of preserving a pronunciation is probably Vietnamese, which you can see in the lower left-hand side, a picture of a Vietnamese newspaper. And that's because in the Phom Ngoc, or the Vietnamese alphabet, there are a lot of letters that don't quite have corresponding sound to their English letters. For example, if you look at that title that starts with Dao, you can see that the D has a cross through it. The D with the cross through it is what you need to have a hard D sound. If there's no cross through the D, as you can see in some other places on this newspaper, that D will actually sound as a Z sound. And so some of these letter combinations might not be intuitive in that way, or might not be pronounced in a way that we would expect. Another example is that NH letter combination sounds like the ñ or the ñ in Spanish. So a lot of issues with spelling and Latinization that we'll have to struggle through throughout these presentations, but as best as I can, I will try to be consistent within any given language in terms of how I represent those sounds and those words. All right, so last time we left off, we were talking about the five religions of China. And of course, those who are familiar with the spring and autumn period know that it's often called the hundred schools period because there are so many different kinds of philosophical constructs that occurred during this period from 771 BC until roughly 400 BC, right? Because after that point, you start coalescing into the major states, and so these philosophies become more crystallized in terms of which ones survive and which ones don't. But there are five religions that really will guide us through our discussions of China and Chinese inspired East Asia, because in many ways, these religions have shown up in some form or another throughout East Asia. And we talked about folk religions, we talked about Confucianism, but let's go over them a little bit more in depth again. But before we do, one thing that I wanted to point out, which I said last time and which I think is really important to bear in mind, is that Chinese religions are not exclusivist. A person can believe multiple of these religions at the same time, using their core competency as the point of belief and ignoring or minimizing those points where another religion has a core competency. So, as I pointed out, with regards to Buddhism, Buddhism doesn't really say much about what gods exist, what supernatural world exists. Buddhism is much more concerned with how to live your life in this world. But conversely, folk religion often tells us about the gods in heaven and how they operate and whether individual items or places have spirits. What do the ancestors do after they die? These are all questions answered by the folk religions. So, where Buddhism doesn't have an answer, the folk religions do have an answer. And conversely, the folk religions tell us very little about how to practice in day to day life. There are certain types of rituals or structures that they may support, but by and large, they don't teach us about things like meditation or about uh, restraining impulses or about regards for sacred texts and the studies of sutras. Those things come from Buddhism. And so you have this sort of balance where each one is focusing on a certain aspect. And in that way, a person becomes a fully religious person by taking on multiple religions at the same time. Now, with regard to folk religions, as there's a question about whether legalism can be properly considered a religion, and that's actually a really great question. When it comes to religions in a Chinese context, what we should understand is that some of them have supernatural components, like Shintoism clearly does, but many of them are philosophical constructs about how to build states or philosophical constructs about how you should interact with other people, and not necessarily religions in the sense of what somebody believes. And so the impression that legalism creates is this idea of the legitimacy of a unified state. Now, of course, during the Han period, we'll see that to a certain degree, legalism is attacked because of its lack of morality for the emperor and lack of constraint on the emperor, because legalism imagines a completely absolutist system. But the idea of a unitary state and the morality of a unitary state is something very legalistic. Um, and a lot of the reforms that Qin Shi Huang made and we're going to talk about in this presentation are ones that endure even if his dynasty did not endure. And so, in that way, legalism is a religion in the sense of it informing the beliefs about what is moral, desirable, and ethical in a Chinese worldview. I think that's a really great question. But if we get back to the folk religions, right, we have different folk religions in different regions. Right? China has Shintoism, Korea has Mugyo, you have Japan has Shintoism, uh, Vietnam has its own, Vietnam has a Dao Long. You have all of these different kind of religions that exist that talk about different gods. In the conception of the Shinists, for example, you have the Jade Emperor who sits on his heavenly throne, and he has his courtiers and he has his demons, and all these individuals that exist in the heavenly court to mirror the earthly court. And in fact, a lot of Shinnism constructs heaven in much the way that earth is constructed to give legitimacy both to earthly institutions and a requirement that earthly institutions have to emulate the heavenly institutions. One of the commonalities across most of these traditions is that the gods generally care very little about what's going on earth. That doesn't mean that they're opposed to the successes and failures of people on earth, but it does mean that they are not actively involved unless they are persuaded to be involved. They take a very apathetic look towards things in the mortal realm. And now there's a question here about where does Christianity fit? Christianity is certainly a religion that exists in China today, but it is not a historic religion in the East Asian context. And so when Christianity comes in, that's an element of the 19th century, really. In fact, Islam has a much longer presence in China. There have been Hui for at least 1,000 years, if not longer. But by and large, these two religions haven't contributed to the Chinese collective perception of what a person should do, what a person should worship, how government should be structured, what's the role of a citizen or a subject relative to the imperial authority, all of these different things. And so that's the reason why I didn't include Christianity or Islam, despite those religions having large followings in China today. There's a point that Christianity made it to China as early as the year 700, and it's true, but there are a lot of religions that exist in China or in East Asia in small numbers. If we're talking about communities of millions, tens of millions, right, where you're beginning to actually change public perception, the Christianity just wasn't there until the 20th century. All right. So if we remember, um, Confucianism, of course, starts with the personality of Confucius. And so we have Confucius operating primarily in the state of Lu. And he was living during this spring and autumn period. So to set the scene, you had this large Zhou kingdom, which controlled significant amounts of territory in the North China Plain and certain areas outside of the North China Plain. And that Zhou kingdom disintegrated. We'll talk more about that when we get to the history. But what's really important here is that as the Zhou kingdom disintegrated, it disintegrated primarily because of the disconnect between the various lords that have been appointed in different regions and the Zhou king himself. So they would simply stop paying tribute, they would have increased autonomy, and eventually it was the point where the Zhou no longer had power to administer over the region. So you have a situation where Confucius is trying to figure out the moral nature to restore in a certain way the Zhou kingdom, that sense of unity, that sense of purpose, and that sense of direction that China had lost now that you were in a situation where over 200 different states, and you can see a map that sort of shows what the situation was about 100 years before Confucius was born. All these different states were fighting and causing disharmony and struggle. And so Confucius wanted to understand what was the way to restore something like the United Zhou Kingdom had been. And he fundamentally believed that it was a collapse in morality and proper behavior that led to this outcome. And so by each person writing their individual behavior, the entire system as a whole could be righted. In many ways, it's the inverse of Plato's conception, right, that we see in the Western world, which is that, right, if you want to order a man's soul, imagine how you would order a city. And that's the entire treatise of the Republic. In Confucius's view, once you order the person, the city will become ordered. So it's almost a reverse of this idea. And of course, he came up with uh, a number of sayings and beliefs that ring very true to Western ears as well. There's a point in the Analects where Zugong asked, is there any one word that could guide a person throughout life? The master, being Confucius, replied, how about reciprocity? Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. The golden rule exists in many contexts. This is just one among many of those contexts. And while Confucius in life wanted to improve the rulers in his world, in fact, he served Duke Ding of Lu for a while, trying to improve his morality. The fact that Ding spent a lot more time with his concubines than attending to matters of state is what led to Confucius becoming a teacher as opposed to an advisor. And he came up with five core ideas that he believed were critical to rebuilding that kind of ordered state, that creating ordered people. You have the sense of integrity and wisdom, two qualities that are quite self-definitional. Then you have ethical behavior, rituals and etiquette, and benevolence. And these ideas all worked in tandem to create a better person. So when it came to ethical behavior and benevolence, ethical behavior was often by doing what was right, despite it not necessarily resulting in a positive outcome for the individual. The point of that ethical behavior was that it reflects the right order of society, that the person is putting themselves into the proper position in the hierarchy. So we had and we discussed this last time, the two examples of the son who is melting ice with his body to fish for his mother. And of course, the son is in pain doing this, but this is an act of filial piety. This is an act of respect towards his mother, who is his superior, and therefore he is harming himself for her benefit. In the same way, at a much higher level, Yue Fei, who was a general in the Southern Song Army, walked away from a victory that he could have had at Kaifeng when the emperor commanded him to do so. And he knew that walking away from that battle would probably lead to his death, and that's exactly what happened. He was executed as part of a peace offering with the enemy that he would have attacked, which was the Jin. When it comes to benevolence, it's about respecting relationships and behaving positively in both the role of the superior in the relationship and the role of the inferior of the relationship. So those who are in inferior positions should show love upwards to those who are superior. And the more superior they are, the more love they should be shown, right? Which is where there's an incredible reverence towards the king or what will be the emperor. But conversely, it's not as if the king or the emperor can do anything to deserve that respect. And a benevolent leader will be marked by the fact that he lightens penalties, reduces taxes, and uses less corvée labor. He's somebody who's actually respecting the people. And as we point out, when it comes to cardinal relationships where there are superiors and inferiors, these are the five traditional relationships, the superior role has a duty to comfort and guide the inferior person and to love, care, and teach the inferior person. It's not enough to have power over them. That power needs to be constrained in a cultured and organized way. And in the same way, the inferior has a duty not to disrespect the superior, not to try and carve his own way. He has to accept the will of the superior because the superior is doing those things that are in his benefit, right? So this feeds into itself. And because of that, in order to negotiate these relationships, there are rules of etiquette that need to be followed, specific ceremonies that need to happen. between these different parties to recognize those forms of respect in a way that both the superior and the inferior can see. And so we have within Confucianism a strong predilection towards the historic modes of behavior. Things like performing acts of worship, if those acts were formed historically, bowing, um, providing food and exchanging gifts. All of these are aspects of Li, these behaviors that are designed to represent that an inferior is showing a superior respect and that a superior is showing an inferior guidance and care. And that moves us into Taoism, right? The third religion. Taoism is the hardest religion really to qualify in terms of what it teaches and what it says. At a fundamental point, the teachings concern Lao Tzu and his student Zhuangzi that I'm just going to sort of hybridize here as if they were one teacher. The fundamental core of Taoism is that the world exists as a certain element in nature that behaves according to certain pre-existing paradigms. And only by understanding and respecting those paradigms can a person find internal contentment and can the system be prosperous. What does that mean functionally? It means functionally that there is something called the Tao, and the Tao is the way that the world is. We could call it the state of nature, we could call it the way that people interact with each other, what have you. Now, the Taoist doesn't argue that the state of nature is something like a Hobbesian sense of man killing man, no order, laws, or anarchy. His state of nature is the Chinese village. And in this Chinese village, he says that a person should exhibit wu wei, or and which is sometimes laughably translated as do nothing, but it really means do not detract or deflect or remove yourself from the natural order to follow the Tao. So a common point here would be that if you're in a farming village and you're a farmer and that's your job, you should seek to continue being a farmer. You should be the best farmer that you are. You don't need to go to the neighboring village. There's nothing in the neighboring village that your village doesn't have. You don't want to be innovative. You don't want to change the way things are done. In fact, change is viewed very suspiciously in the Taoist world because that's going to be something that doesn't necessarily lead to a positive outcome. And many Taoists had the opposite reaction to the Confucians by the dissolution of the Zhou kingdom. The Confucian resolution was that the style of the Zhou needed to be emulated once more. And by emulating the way that the Zhou behaved, that sort of cultural sophistication, then the empire will hold together. The Taoists believe that trying to believe that you have an answer about what is necessary to bring back stability is itself the problem. We should in turn look towards nature and natural influences in order to create the environment that will be peaceful and self-sustaining, rather than trying to claim that we know what specific relationships or rituals or ideas are going to lead to that. And so it follows also that Taoists have a strong sense that there's a natural Tao to the human body and Tao to relationships. And so you have these concepts that develop out of Taoism naturally because they relate to these sort of natural tendencies of the body. Probably the most famous of these is acupuncture and Qi medicine. If the body has certain pathways, if the body has certain ways that it is, then you can study those ways and affect them in a way that doesn't necessarily go from a medical perspective to the heart of the problem. And the Taoists will argue that certain parts of the body are connected to other parts of the body by the Tao, by that natural way that things are. And you can perform acts of medicine or self-improvement by targeting zones that are connected to the zone in problem. Another conception that comes out of Taoism is the idea of the yin yang. Now, the yin yang has two pieces that we should focus on. The first one is, of course, the fact that there are binaries that the yin yang divides the world into, be it light and dark, male and female, heaven and earth, active and passive. But there's also the dot that exists in the yin yang, where the dot is inside of the totality of the other side, which is to say that these two elements, these two binaries, cannot truly be separate. And that in order for the Tao to exist, in order for the natural world to exist, both sides of the yin and the yang need to be there. And furthermore, to fully disentangle them would be to deny their nature. A man doesn't mean anything without the presence of woman. And there's no man that is truly completely masculine. Every man has certain aspects of the feminine in him, right? And conversely, no woman is truly feminine. Every woman has aspects of the masculine in her. And so the yin yang represents both that the binary exists, but that the binary isn't final, and that there's a relationship there that needs to be maintained, coaxed, and nurtured. And in the same way, although the Taoists didn't create this, the idea of the mandate of heaven was part of the Zhou kingdom. We'll talk about that in a bit. The Taoists considered the idea of the mandate of heaven to be a natural state of the world, that dynasties would rise and fall because that is the nature of the world, to create these sorts of governments. These governments weaken, and Chinese history had seen it before. But we should go over what the mandate of heaven is, given it that it's such a fundamental concept in Chinese dynastic cycle. So you start with an old dynasty. That old dynasty becomes rather weak. It begins to tax people highly. It lets the infrastructure decay. People are treated unfairly. And so a number of actions begin to crop up. You start having natural disasters and peasant revolts. You might have successful invasions from barbaric tribes. The level of crime increases. All of these things, these calamities signal that the old dynasty is no longer capable of performing what it needs to perform. And you can imagine how strong of a Confucian gloss that has, right? That the leaders aren't able to protect and care for those beneath them. They're not able to show benevolence, and they're certainly not able to show integrity or wisdom. So what ends up happening is that there's a rebellion to fight this old dynasty, and a new dynasty is created, and that new dynasty changes the situation by protecting the people, by rebuilding the infrastructure, and by bringing peace and justice. And so the Taoists see this kind of flow as the natural ebb of history. The next of the major religions of China is Buddhism. So when we talk about Buddhism, we have to understand that although Buddhism was founded in India in the 6th century BC by Siddhartha Gautama, that religion doesn't make its way to China for several centuries. In fact, the first Buddhist temple in China is the White Horse Temple in Luoyang, which was built in 68 CE. So that should give you a sense of how long it took Buddhism to come to China. But even then, Buddhism did not really establish itself in China until the Han Dynasty. And there's a famous story that is recalled where Emperor Ming of Han saw in a dream a god whose body had the brilliance of the sun and who flew before his palace, and he rejoiced exceedingly at this. The next day he asked his officials, "What god is this?" The scholar Fu Yi said, "Your subject has heard it said that in India there is someone who has attained the Tao and who is called the Buddha. He flies in the air, his body had the brilliance of the sun. This must be that god." Now those who are familiar with anything that Buddhism teaches will notice immediately um, you can see immediately that this doesn't look anything like the conception of Buddhism in India. Siddhartha Gautama's followers in India did not talk about him flying in the air, did not speak of him being as brilliant as the sun, or Brighton anyway. Um, and so these characteristics don't seem to represent anything that Buddhism actually stands for. But even more interesting is the characterization of what the Buddha has done. The Buddha has achieved the Tao. And in many ways, that may actually be an effective way of representing in Chinese ideas what Buddhism is, in the sense of achieving enlightenment, understanding. Because if you read the Buddhist sutras, the concept of the enlightenment is the understanding of the way the world works, detachment from its structures, and the ability to just be connected with the nature of the universe. That's the Tao. If he's achieved the Tao, then he has effectively achieved enlightenment. And so this is a Chinese characterization of what the Buddha has done, but not a great characterization of who the Buddha is. And so you can see this sort of push and pull between what Buddhism taught in India and what it teaches in China. We're going to dig a little deeper in that. There's a question here about, so yin yang is sort of an operative both and rather than a conflict oriented either or. That's exactly right. Um, the concept of opposites being at diametrical opposition is primarily a Western Christian perspective uh, on relationships. Um, right? You have God and Satan, you have heaven and hell, you have the saved and the unsaved, and so these categories are binary and exclusive. The Taoists say that they're binary but not exclusive, and in fact, the binary can never be truly binary. And both sides need each other in order to exist in the world. That there needs to be that sense of impurity. So one of the things that we need to talk about when we talk about Buddhism in China is the concept of translation. And it's not just the translation of words, although we'll get into that, but it's also the concept of translation of symbols and the translation of goals. Because in a Chinese context, a lot of the goals of Buddhism either didn't make sense, or to the extent that they did make sense, had to be reinterpreted for a Chinese audience to better appreciate both at that time and increasingly in the present. And I want to draw attention to two Buddhist scholars, Lokaksema and Kang Senghui. So Lokaksema is primarily known by his Sanskrit name, which is why it doesn't follow any of the Chinese spelling conventions. He translated a number of Buddhist texts into Chinese. He moved to China. He was not a native Chinese speaker, but he learned the language. It's believed that he was from the people of Kushan, which is a Central Asian people, so around where Kyrgyzstan is today. But when he came to translating the sutras, he would eventually come to the points where there are complex terms in Sanskrit. And the question was, how do you explain these terms in Chinese? And there are really two ways he could go about doing this. The first one is, of course, that he would just sound out how these words are and then write that in Chinese characters. So it would be gibberish from an ideographic perspective, right? Because remember, Chinese is written in symbols, but it would be pronounceable in the same way that if I wrote you are as the letters, it doesn't mean anything, but when you hear it, it means Youare. Or what Lokaksema could do is try and find a Chinese equivalent in the same way that in the vision, the emperor saw someone who achieved the Tao, right? The Tao being a translation of the concept of enlightenment that would make sense to a Chinese speaker. You could use that system and represent the ideas of Buddhism in Chinese words and Chinese concepts. Lukaksema took the former approach. And so if when we read his manuscripts, they'll have 6 or 7 characters in a row that don't make sense unless you know Sanskrit, in which case you're slowly sounding them out and trying to figure out what he said. Kang Senghui took a very different approach. He took the approach of the translation of the ideas, and that really caught on in a Chinese context. And so Buddhist scholars increasingly, as time went on, would use these Chinese translations of ideas rather than the Buddhist terms in Sanskrit that were harder for them to pronounce and connect to. And we can already see this by the mid fourth century when we have a number of writings in Buddhism increasingly becoming more and more common, and temples developing throughout, at that time, was a disunited China. We then have ideas that change or are otherwise abandoned in the context of Buddhism. One particular idea that gets abandoned pretty quickly is the suffering Buddha. For those who are familiar with the origins of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama was a prince in India who wanted for nothing, but he saw the suffering of his people and he wanted to understand the cause of the suffering. So he went under a tree and he fasted for 49 days. And this is the moment when he reaches his epiphany about what the world is and how the world works, right? This enlightenment that he achieves. And in this context, he understands that the world is unsatisfactory, that it has problems and pitfalls and other issues that prevent people from seeing how reality truly is and appreciating what they have. But of course, that realization comes in tandem with his suffering from 49 days of fasting. And so we have numerous sculptures. This particular one happened to be in Ireland, but it was originally from Pakistan, um, of the Buddha with his ribs exposed because he was famished. That's a part of the story. Now, within Chinese culture, however, the idea of a famished leader, a famished religious leader, um, would give the impression that this person was poor, that this person was unable to sustain himself, not that this person was wise. And so we end up having a translation of the concept of the Buddha's wisdom and the Buddha's culture by making him larger, that he had material success. So you will often see Buddhas from the subcontinent in this very skin and bones sort of way with uh, either a neutral expression or a sad expression because of the suffering. But you will often see Chinese Buddhas overweight and smiling because they are successful. They have achieved something. And so the representation of having achieved and being cultured is that way of being large and happy. Another interesting conversion of ideas comes from the translation of uh, Avalokiteshvara. So the Buddha, of course, was the first under Buddhism's strictures to achieve enlightenment, to find out the nature of how all things are. But the Buddha never claimed that he had exclusive purview to this. In fact, the entire religion is to help others achieve that sense of enlightenment and purpose. And those who managed to do it in their lifetime were called bodhisattva. One of these bodhisattva was Avalokiteshvara, and that may well be the most famous of all of the bodhisattva. But Avalokiteshvara was a man who is distinguished by many specific traits. He was known as being very caring, very supportive, very thoughtful. And so when Avalokiteshvara came to China, his translation in terms of those attributes of caring, of supportive, was female. And so it didn't matter from the Chinese perspective the biological reality of who Avalokiteshvara was as a human being, but the concepts that he represented. And so, in the Chinese sense, he has become a woman. And in fact, most Chinese don't know that Avalokiteshvara is a man and will just simply pray to Guanyin, who is his translation into Chinese. One of the interesting interplays, of course, between all the different religions of China is that Guanyin has also become a goddess in her own right in the Shinist tradition. And so you'll see many um, retellings, for example, of Shinist stories, um, things like the issues in the heavenly court and the stories of the bull demon and so on, where Guanyin takes a role despite her not actually being a traditional Shinist god. She became a Shinist god as part of the inclusion of Buddhism into the religions of China. And it's worth pointing out that the type of Buddhism that prevails in East Asia and the type of Buddhism that prevails in Southeast Asia are two different Buddhisms. In East Asia, with the exception of Tibet, you have Mahayana Buddhism. In Tibet, there's what's called Vajrayana. But you have Mahayana in East Asia, and that includes Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, Taiwan. Um, and in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, places like Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, uh, and Laos, you have Theravada. And so the Mahayana is much more open to the emotionality of the Buddha and the practices of Buddhism, much more, and it's much more important to bring people towards enlightenment um, than it is necessarily to follow the specific traditions of the priests and the guarding of the sutras. Um, Not to say that the Buddhists in China are any less religious, but they're more open to bringing others in and the increasing uh, de-stratification, perhaps we could say, of Buddhism with regards to the people. And of course, the last religion, which is going to be very important to the rest of today's discussion, is legalism. So legalism really develops from the philosophies of Shangyang, who lived in the Qin court about 390 to 338 BCE. And Shangyang was at that time promoting his ideas, and his ideas were receiving a lot of consternation, especially because they were fundamentally distinct from the ideas that had preceded him. Historically, in the Zhou kingdom, you had a ruler, and below that ruler were ministers, and those ministers would then deal with an aristocracy that existed across the various different provinces of China. And that aristocracy was really the ones whose rules went down to the commoners. So the ruler was, in a sense, a manager of a number of managers, not a direct ruler. And this gave the aristocracy an incredible amount of power in this structure. And according to Shangyang, was the ultimate reason why this system collapsed. The aristocrats were simply able to cut themselves free of the ministers and then rule their own little fiefdoms. And so Shangyang argued that the Qin rulers that he served, as he served in the state of Qin, should do everything they could to standardize their control and to remove as best as they could the power of the aristocrats. And so you can imagine sort of the type of territory that he would construct as indicated by that pink circle. So you have this circle and you divide it evenly into tracts. Those tracts are assigned to governors who have direct loyalty to the ruler and can make no decisions of their own. They can only implement the laws the ruler gives them, which means that they have very minimal power to affect any change. And slowly but surely, you would eat away at the patrician estates. These are the estates of those who are wealthy and therefore can, to a certain degree, push back on the ruler. And you can see those represented by sort of that white circle. Those white circles would be increasingly made smaller, those families increasingly weakened, until there is a uniformity in terms of the governance structure, all coming from the ruler. Now, legalism at its core supported two distinct but parallel ideas: the unification of power and the standardization of and standardization of functions within the empire. Um, so in terms of the unification, we already saw, for example, that it's the attempt to standardize uh, all of the areas of land in terms of their power deriving directly from the ruler. And a successor ideologically to Shang Yang was Han Fei, who wrote in the famous treatise that bears his name, Han Feizi, um, that it was critical that the enlightened ruler controls his ministers simply by means of two handles, that is, punishment and favor. And what did he mean by this exactly? He meant that the in his view, the fundamental issue with the Zhou kingdom was that the various ministers at the different levels had their own abilities to inflict punishment and reward good behavior. And when those ministers had that power, they were able to arrogate to themselves loyalty from their subordinates and able to effectively use those subordinates as a clique to reject the power of the Zhou kingdom more broadly. So it's very important that the king never delegate this simple power, the two handles of reward and punishment, to anybody else. Only he should have the ability to reward and punish, because then he would decide who rises and who falls, and would prevent the ability of any of the bureaucrats from seceding from the larger state. In terms of standardization, just as the land was standardized, all the economic functions should be standardized. And we'll see under the Qin exactly how that happens. One of the one of the ideological problems of legalism is its idea for standardization applied to thought. Because when standardization is applied to thought, it ultimately leads to the removal of those who don't think the same way. And we'll talk about the burning of books and scholars, which is a direct result of legalist thought, when we get to that part of the Qin dynasty later today. There's a comment here. It's interesting that the Buddhist concepts most celebrated in Western culture today, including Buddha images, are much closer to the Chinese, yet almost exclusively represented as Indian. Yes, a lot of people who studied Buddhism, especially like in recent times, have gone to China to study it, and so that, or they've gone to Japan or somewhere else in East Asia because those places are more accessible in many ways than India is. Additionally, Buddhism isn't very common in India. It exists, but it's less than 2% of the population. So a lot of people who are looking for Buddhism generally don't think to look in India. So now as we move into the history. So if we remember, right, most of the ancient period in China starts in that orange area on the map, that area that circles the Sea of Bohai, which is called the North China Plain. And as a very, very cursory overview of the Shang and Zhou, these are two ancient Chinese states. Both of them were kingdoms that stretched almost across the entirety of the North China Plain. And the Shang basically expanded from what we saw before. We saw, for example, Erlito, which was a uh, either Xia dynasty or contemporaneous with the Xia dynasty settlement. They expanded to become larger kingdoms that controlled significant areas across the North China Plain. And in so doing, they were able to create a functional system of governance. That said, eventually there was a Zhou rebellion, and the Zhou were able to succeed the Shang. But the Zhou had to legitimate why it was that they were able to overpower the Shang, and so they invented or they described, we can say, the mandate of heaven. In this mandate, you have a situation, right, that we discussed before, where the previous dynasty was not living up to its requirements in action, and so a new dynasty had to come in order to replace it. But of course, this created a key constraint among the Zhou, which is that they had to be at least demonstrably more benevolent than the Shang were. Otherwise, they would lose the mandate of heaven. Uh, so their own system of legitimation prevented them from becoming as absolutist as they otherwise could have been. We also see during the Zhang an incredible cultural flowering, especially during the first 300 years, which is around the year 1000 BC to around 770 BC. And this is demonstrated by the large amounts of bronze working that we find. In fact, this is the biggest bronze era in Chinese history. But what's important for us to dwell upon in terms of what it means for us is several different aspects of the Zhou's governing style. So the Zhou imagined the world to exist as a pyramid, and at the top of that pyramid was heaven or Tian, and below the heaven was the king or Wang. Below that were the Zhuhou, who were the regional rulers, then the ministers, and then the general population. And these ministers and regional rulers were put in different regions throughout the Zhou territory in what were called fengjian, or estates. Now, these estates are actually very similar to the feudal states that existed in Europe in the Middle Ages, in the sense that they were ruled by a specific family, and that specific family would have a number of peasants that would live on that piece of land, and those peasants would be tied to the land. In fact, this was the creation of serfdom in the East Asian context for the first time. Now, one of the interesting developments is that because of the creation of serfs in the Fengjian system, that by and large, China did not have a slave trade. That's not to say that it didn't have any slaves at all, or that slavery wasn't a part of the Chinese society. But by and large, the slave trade missed China because serfdom already existed, and therefore created the large amounts of unpaid labor uh, at a local level that were necessary. And at a governmental level, you can always have corvée, which is when you enslave free people to perform labor as a way of tax payments or similar. But it's not technically slavery because you're not buying and selling people. But this Fengjian system was exactly as we pointed out, what led to the decay of the Zhou government. Because all of these different people, all these different tribes that you can see, sorry, all of these different ministers that you can see ruling different areas of the Zhou kingdom basically declared independence. And some of the names might even look familiar to those who know some more recent, some later period of Chinese history. Like, for example, what was happening around the 200s BC. You can see Yan and Ji and Qi and Lu and Shen. So we then move into the spring and autumn period. There's a question, this theme similar to the caste system. Once born into a category, people could people move up? With respect to the emperor, right, or the king, you could never really move up unless you became the king or emperor. But in terms of becoming a minister, there actually was a degree of mobility in ancient China. Not a great one, but there was one. And that is the meritocratic examination system. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we talk about the Qin, and we'll talk about it a lot more when we talk about the Han in 2 weeks. The meritocratic system required you to take tests and answer questions that showed a knowledge of culture and society and were not necessarily tailored to the professional needs of whatever that advisory capacity was, but more on the sense of being Chinese and being aware of what was going on in the cultural milieu of China. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the Han's predilection for Confucian scholars. But if you were in the lower classes and somehow managed to figure out all of this information, there was a possibility of class mobility in the Chinese system. It's not as firm as the Indian caste system where you can never escape your caste. And somebody commented that's civil service. That's exactly what that is. It's civil service. So, to explain a little bit about the spring and autumn period. So, as we mentioned, the Zhou have been in power for over 200 years at this point, and we have a fundamental demonstration about the weakness of the Zhou because of the system that they had created. Namely, that the various regional governors, the Zhuhou, were able to arrogate to themselves more and more power. And we see this in the Chuanrong attack of 770 BCE. So the Chuanrong were a nomadic people who existed west of the Zhou controlled areas of China. And like most nomadic people, they were able to punch above their weight in terms of their military exploits. But what was surprising was not that the Chuanrong tried to invade China. What was surprising is that several of the Zhuhou, these regional governors, allied with them, and their troops and their soldiers gathered from the different fengjian that they controlled actually marched on the capital of the Zhou state. When they arrived, the Zhou found themselves unable to defend, and the king, uh, Zhou Ping, um, was forced to flee the capital, and create a new capital further east. In fact, this period after the flight is often called the Eastern Zhou, specifically because the capital moved east. What also demonstrates the new power that these various leaders, these various Zhuhou had, is that the defense of the eastern capital, this new capital that Zhou Ping fled to, was other warlords, other Zhuhou from other parts of the country. And so it increasingly became the case that the Zhou king was himself not the one truly in power, but these Zhuhou, these regional governors, were the ones who were able to exercise local authority and control the political situation. And it only decayed from there. Because as soon as it was clear that the king couldn't control much, the king stopped being able to control much of anything. And so you have this symbol of legal authority that none of the Zhuhou attempt to usurp, but you have a situation that functionally he's not really ruling over anything anymore. So this creates what's called the spring and autumn period, often named for the annals that are written about this time period. And this is a period when we see the creation of Confucianism and Daoism as a result of that collapse of the Zhou system. But we also see other types of literature flower in this period as well. This is actually one of China's most productive uh, periods in thought and discovery. A philosophy that I haven't mentioned, for example, is Mohism, which is successful during this period and professes universal love. This philosophy is interesting, not that it professes universal love, although unique for China to do that, but that they have an interesting way of achieving it, which is mutually assured destruction. So they would go and send themselves out as defense ministers to the various different Zhuhou in this spring and autumn period and teach them how to build defensive ramparts and other strongly defensive technologies, things like castles and so on. Because the idea was that if every one of these leaders believed that every one of these other leaders was too strong to attack, they would just break out in peace. Um, they were sadly incorrect. There were, of course, others who came from a completely different side of the spectrum and were believing more towards belligerence. And of course, you have Master Wu, um, more famously known as Sun Tzu, who wrote his treatise, The Art of War, having served in several of the courts of different different Zhuhou, and remarking on what he saw on the battlefields in terms of what worked and what didn't. And of course, his book is still well subscribed to, both in China and outside of China. So, if we start moving towards the end of the spring and autumn period, and we start moving towards the consolidation of these Zhuhou into these functional kingdoms, they started taking on the title of king, especially after the Zhou were so substantially weakened. And two of these states are worth taking a few seconds to talk about. The first one I want to address is the state of Chu. The state of Chu is the largest of these states in terms of population and organization, but it's also the least Chinese of these states. You can see how far south the Chu territory extends. It extends to the southern banks of the Yangtze River, and it controls many territories where the population is not Sinicized completely at this point. And in fact, we have documents from the state of Chu where they actually reject the identity of being Chinese. Of course, they didn't use the word Han to describe themselves. That is a term that modern Chinese use to describe themselves. But basically, they say that they do not belong under heaven, which was the title denoting this idea of all Chinese exist under heaven. And so, what we should understand from Chu, and we'll see this a little bit in Qin as well. Qin, by the way, is Qin, right? Um, what we see in both Chu and Qin is that these are groups that are expanding outside of the North China Plain. In the case of Qin, they're extending into the Sichuan Highlands. In the case of Chu, they're extending into the Yangtze and sorry, the Yangtze and Hudi river basins. So sorry, the Huai, sorry, yeah, the Yangtze and Huai river basins. And so they're incorporating significant populations of non-Han, non-Sinicized individuals into their territory as they continue their expansion. The goal of such expansion in turn being to have the population to then be able to throw at these other states. So in the middle of all this chaos, you have a merchant by the name of Liu Buwei. Um, and Liu is coming from the state of Zhao. And in the state of Zhao, he notices a prince. Now, of course, this is not his king title would be Yiren, um, and that sort of gives away a little bit of the plot. But to make it simple, I'm just going to call him Yiren even at this period. So he is 18th on the line of succession to the Qin throne. So functionally, there's pretty much no way he'll ever become king. But Liu Buwei takes a shine to him and begins to uh, use his wealth in order to grease the way for Yiren to become king of Qin. And in fact, he manages to do that. There are stories that King Yiren had a concubine that he really enjoyed, which was actually Liu Buwei's concubine. And Liu Buwei, realizing that this was the goose that lays the golden egg, actually gave Yiren his concubine. Now, Sima Qian, who's a Chinese historian, argues that she was pregnant at the time of this transfer, meaning that Yiren's son, who will be the star of our show, is actually Lu Buwei's son. There is significant doubt among Chinese historians as to whether or not that's accurate or likely. But Sima Qian is accurate when it comes to other negative issues. So it's possible that he's right here. The detraction is primarily because, as a Han dynasty era writer, he had strong prejudices against the Qin. And so he may have been using this to cast aspersions on the validity of that son, right? Qin Shi Huang. So take that for what you will. But regardless, this relationship between Liu Buwei and King Yiren survived for quite a while and it made Liu incredibly wealthy. Of course, things completely unraveled when it turned out that the king's mother, Zhao Ji, um, and her false eunuch, Lao Ai, were plotting to overthrow him. Were plotting to overthrow um, his son, Qin Shi Huang. So Zhao Ji, Zhao Ji is Yiren's concubine and Qin Shi Huang's mother. But she had not been content at court after Yiren died, and so she was given a eunuch. But of course, this was a eunuch who was not properly castrated, and so she enjoyed his company very much, and they consorted to overthrow Qin Shi Huang. Now, Liu Buwei was also implicated in this, and so while Zhao Ji and Lao Ai were executed, he fled and then later self-poisoned to prevent himself from being executed um, as a result of the issues. So we now meet our star of the show, right? Qin Shi Huangdi. And when Qin came to power, in addition to executing his mother and her boy toy, he did a number of critical acts in terms of organizing and building up the Qin. The first one is that he strongly identified with the legalist scholars and their promotion of centralization and unification. Within the state of Qin, he worked assiduously to standardize laws, to standardize weights and measures, and to promote those who demonstrated clear ability over those with family ties. He was incredibly pragmatic um, in terms of how he was going to proceed in terms of the organizing the affairs of state. And he arrogated to himself any individual he thought might be able to explain more to him than others. Now, we could talk about this chronologically because it's after he united China, but it's worth pointing out that he responded very harshly uh, to those who disagreed with his authority. And that authority also included his philosophical authority. And so in the year 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of all books that had any kind of philosophy or history or ideology that was not favorable to him and his philosophies, especially the legalist philosophy that he endorsed. And so he burned books from all over China. But you have to remember also that most society was illiterate. And so scholars were often living libraries, having memorized books and transmitted them. And so scholars who defended these books were killed, but also scholars who were functionally books were killed in order to prevent them from being able to spread their word. The ideological purity was very important. And it's worth pointing out that this kind of severity when it came to the destruction of scholars is not unique in terms of what Qin Shi Huang did. Most of his laws, while standardized, were incredibly punitive from our present day standard. Uh, they look sort of like the Jean Valjean kind of laws, right? Where you steal a little bit of bread to survive and you have your leg cut off. So, and in fact, if we go through the legal codex from Qin Shi Huang's time, we see numerous types of amputations, lots of things receiving death. Very little is, for want of a better term, commensurate with the crime. But the legalist philosophy that Qin Shi Huang supported actually had one surprising difference relative to a lot of the other legal systems that existed in China. It had the rule of law. Qin's laws applied to everybody equally. The most powerful advisor, the poorest merchant. It didn't matter. The laws were clearly stated and obvious, and you knew that if you violated them, what would happen to you. Now, what would happen to you was absolutely atrocious. But because the legalist state created the rule of law, it made it much easier to functionally unite the territory because people knew what to expect and what behavior was requested. So we talked about what Qin Shi Huang did on a domestic front in terms of consolidating his power structures. We should also talk about how he developed his military, because spoiler alert, he starting from the state of Qin, he's able to conquer the state of Zhao, the state of Yan, the state of Han, the state of Wei, the state of Chu, and eventually the state of Qi. So how does he do all of this? And it's a combination of tactics and inventions. So the first thing that we should understand is that he is really the first person to put together a professional army within the context even of the warring states. And this is a professional army that we know from the types of sculptures he made in his terracotta warrior mausoleum. We'll talk about that. Included cavalrymen with stirrups, which is a huge innovation in terms of allowing you to navigate effectively with a horse. Um, Charioteers as well, infantrymen and bowmen, and was able to quickly rally these troops up from the different regions. One of the difficulties during the Zhou Kingdom, right, with the delegation of power to these Zhuhou in their Fengjian, um, was that the Zhuhou were responsible for organizing a military delegation that would be sent to the king when the king was calling for soldiers to fight in defense of defense of the kingdom. Since the regional governors had no real power under Qin Shi Huangdi, the military could be directly conscripted, and the generals reported directly to Qin Shi Huang. And this centralization meant that orders could be effected much more effortlessly. In fact, one of the ways that we see that Qin Shi Huang is able to effect orders is through what's called the fu, or in English, it's often translated as tally. And it looks like a lion or a cat with Chinese characters emblazoned on its back. But there's something that you can see if you look very closely. It's actually divided in half. In order for a general to receive permission to do anything, he had to have both halves of the fu. Now, of course, he would keep one half himself, but the other half would be kept by Qin Shi Huang. And so if he wanted the general to do something, or the general was requesting something and that request was going to be granted, be it tactics or soldiers or food or what have you, he would receive the second half of the fu. And so in this way, he was able to communicate in a secure way with his generals, uh, giving or denying their requests and refusing to allow any power to exist outside of his person. Another technological advantage that the Qin were working on were large-scale blast furnaces. And we see these all throughout Qin territory, where they were making large amounts of swords and spears in order to go to war with the other states. But when it comes to tactics, we have a wide variety of different tactics that are attempted by Qin Shi Huangdi. Of course, he wanted to win on the battlefield, but that wasn't necessarily always the case. In fact, Qin Shi Huangdi sent three different generals at the same time to the city of Handan, which is the capital of Zhao. But in the city of Handan existed Limu, who who was a very famous defensive strategy general. And he was able to consistently defeat Qin Shi Huangdi's armies on the field of battle. So Qin Shi Huang realized that he couldn't defeat Li Mu on the battlefield. So what he ended up doing is that he bribed ministers in the Zhao court in Handan to accuse Li Mu of being cowardly, um, because he was only fighting a defensive war. He would never take an offensive war against the Qin and would never leave the city. And the bribed courtiers were able to convince the king of Zhao to imprison Li Mu. And once that had happened, once he was removed from effectively defending the city was conquered by Qin Shi Huangdi's forces. And that was in 228 BCE. Now, there were other cases where the king of Qin had an opportunity to attack, which he didn't foresee having a legitimate casus belli for before. And this is in the famous assassination attempt by Jingke of Qin Shi Huangdi in 227 BC, so 1 year after the fall of Handan and the fall of the Zhao kingdom. The courtier from the kingdom of Yan came to Qin Shi Huangdi with a rolled up map of his territory. Presumably, he was a defector trying to give Qin Shi Huangdi the information he would need to defeat the kingdom of Yan. But that actually wasn't the case. When the map was unfurled, it contained a dagger, and Jing Ke tried to use it to assassinate Qin Shi Huangdi. This attack, along with numerous others, made Qin Shi Huangdi paranoid, but he wasn't so paranoid that he forgot that the state of Yan had sent someone to attack him, and so he used that as a casus belli to take out the Yan. Another one of these tactics that really just shows how ruthless um, Qin Shi Huangdi really was, and what he allowed his generals to do is when it came to the people of Wei, a lot of their power was concentrated at the city of Dalian, which is at the corner of two major rivers. What uh, what Qin Shi Huangdi allowed his generals to do was to divert the flow of the rivers so that way they would flood the entire city. And over 100,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed, of course, in the flooding of the city, which then allowed Qin Shi Huangdi to accept the surrender of Wei without significant military expenditure. In fact, several different moves. And in fact, the defeat of Qi was done in much the same way, in that the Qi had defended themselves on the western flank, but Qin Shi Huangdi invaded from the north, coming from the state of Yan that he had conquered, and so was able to catch the city of Qi unaware and get them to surrender that way. So, while we're not going to go through all of the different campaigns that Qin Shi Huangdi did in order to unify all seven of these proto-states into one Chinese state, it's worth pointing out that he was operating from a different paradigm in many cases from a lot of his rivals. Sure, there was court intrigue and bribery that was practiced in other courts, but the system of unification and organization that led to this level of conquest was not paralleled by any of the other states. So now we move into the period of a unified empire, where Qin Shi Huangdi is able to control all of the affairs of state. And I want to draw your attention to how he managed to unify, in many ways, the functioning across China. One of the commonalities across China is the use of ideographic writing. Now, this is the idea that you represent an idea with a symbol. Like the number two, when it's written as just a number, doesn't have any two-ness to it, right? It's not like, for example, the Roman number two, where there's two lines, and therefore you could think, oh, well, two is two. It doesn't have anything that represents the sounds of T or U inside of it. It's just a curve. And we just agree that that curve with that small foot that jags out and that comes out on the right side, represents the concept of two. And that's what we call an ideograph. It's a symbol that represents an idea. So all of the different states from Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin all used an ideographic writing system, but the ideographic writing systems were wildly varied between the different states. When the states were unified, it was the characters of the Qin state that became the official writing form of all of China, and all other writing forms were banned. When it came to currency, the banliang, which was the currency of the Qin state, became the currency of all of China. In this way, commerce could be organized more effectively. And another way to improve commerce was the standardization of axle widths. Now, in the spring and autumn period, the space between the two wheels on a cart, the length of the axle was actually different in different regions. And the point of this was to prevent the effective movement of merchants between different states. That way, you could charge customs, you would have to employ local people to take the package to its final destination, and so on. So, you have a situation that results in a number of trade difficulties between the different states now that there's a unified country. And so, Qin Shi Huang standardized all the widths of the axles and made sure that all the ruts in the road were consistent across the empire. Never mind that he built thousands of kilometers of highways and canalways to connect different regions of his empire. He was also not the first person to build the Great Wall. Portions of the walls had been built before. In fact, if you look at this picture, if you look at, for example, the line that separates the kingdom of Zhao from the beige area, you can see there's this sort of jagged line, and you can see it in the state of Yan as well. Those represent walls against barbarian invasions. And so these walls existed in whole or in part in different regions, but they weren't connected. And there wasn't a consistent way to prevent the barbarians from entering. Qin Shi Huang tried to build a wall that would do that. Now, of course, the Great Wall of China that we know today is not the wall that the Qin built, although much of its bones are from the Qin dynasty. That wall is from the Ming dynasty, about 1,500 years after, yeah, 1,500, 1,700 years after this. But the wall was certainly a substantial construction project, using hundreds of thousands of people to build it. Many of those people unpaid because they were corvée labor. And you had a system of highly oppressive uh, taxation and uh, actions against the impoverished. Now, if we remember, with the Fengjian system of the Zhou, you already had serfs that were bonded to the land, and they were part of this feudal structure. Now, Qin Shi Huangdi accepted the Fengjian system, but he wanted to choose who the governors were. So, from his capital in Xi'an, at that time it was called Chang'an, but it's the modern city of Xi'an, he would choose which individuals he wanted to be the governors of the various regions and appoint them directly. And of course, because of the legalist system, he gave them minimal power uh, to punish or reward, but they still had large scale control of the land and of the people on it. And those people were required to pay incredible amounts of tax on what little they did. On what little they did produce. In some cases, farmers were charged up to 50% of what they made, never mind the fact that they didn't own anything beyond the food that they had cultivated. And in many cases, that tax was paid in labor. Things like building the Great Wall or digging canals or building roads or other infrastructure projects that were going on throughout the empire. And it's worth taking a second to reflect back on that word empire, because Qin Shi Huangdi was the first person to take that title, Huangdi, meaning emperor. Previously, the various rulers, even the Zhou and Shang, used the term king to describe themselves. But this term emperor was taking after the heavenly court. And in this way, Qin Shi Huangdi was proclaiming that he was like a heavenly court over all of China, all under heaven was his. And so, of course, he must be the emperor. But in order for all under heaven to be his, he would need to further expand uh, Chinese civilization and bring it to the regions of southern China. Now, the regions of southern China were deeply desirable because they had numerous unique products, foods, spices, uh, types of wood, all kinds of things that could not be found in the north of China. And of course, there was the small problem that there were a number of indigenous peoples in the region. These people are called Yue, um, in, and they generally received the term of Bai Yue or 100 Yue to refer to their incredible diversity. But what was critical from the Qin perspective is that they be incorporated into the empire that he was constructing. And so we see massive marches against the Bayou. In fact, there are five separate invasions that are required to subdue them because of how bitterly they fight back. And a lot of the infrastructure projects, especially in the southern half of China, that are initiated by Qin Shi Huangdi, are initiated with the goal of promoting this conquest. The Ningqiu, which is a canal that connects two major rivers in the south of China, was specifically created for this purpose to help provision military units, build garrisons and supplies as Han troops moved further and further into the south. And by Han, I mean ethnically Chinese. And of course, the goal was to synthesize these peoples, to teach them to speak Chinese and to have them accept Chinese culture, which is a long and difficult phenomenon that takes centuries. If we remember from our discussions earlier, the state of Chu, which is the state closest to these areas of Yue, um, had a majority of population that was not Chinese. They considered themselves something else. And what they considered themselves as were Yue people under Chinese authority. And increasingly, that's what we begin to see from the the population that comes under the control of Qin Shi Huang. Now, he manages to get control of them in 214. When the Qin Empire collapses in 207 BCE, 7 years later, they rise up in open rebellion, and the Han dynasty takes a while to subdue them as well. So we should understand that while these areas are part of China today, they were not part of China back then and were deeply resistant to becoming Chinese. Once Qin Shi Huang had conquered the south of China, he wanted to conquer the last barrier he could see, and that was mortality. He he believed that his empire, his Qin empire, should exist forever, and therefore he should exist forever to rule it. And so he sent numerous advisors to different places all around the world in order to try and acquire elixirs that would provide immortality. A disproportionate number of these included mercury, and it's believed that Qin Shi Huangdi had mercury poisoning as a result of taking a lot of these elixirs. That combined with the fact that he had several different assassination attempts. We talked about the assassination attempt of Jin Ke, the emissary from the state of Yan. But that wasn't the only one, and the mercury poisoning made him incredibly paranoid, such that he began not promoting people based on merit, which was one of his fundamental attributes for success, but promoting people that he thought he could trust. And increasingly, he became more and more isolated and more unhealthy. He began to decide that he wanted to construct, in the event that he would die, an eternal palace with his own soldiers, acrobats, courtiers, and palace. In fact, the only part of this that has really been unearthed is his 10,000 warrior soldiers. Each soldier is unique, uh, created by artisans to resemble real life soldiers in all of their uniqueness and diversity. Now, beyond this outer courtyard where the soldiers are, is an entire mausoleum, which included an underground palace where Qin Shi Huang himself is buried. To date, given the technology that we possess, Chinese authorities are very much afraid to actually excavate the main tomb for fear of collapsing the mountain that sits on top of it. And you can see just how gigantic that mountain is um, from this picture of the memorial outside of the mountain. But to give you a sense, it's about as tall as the tallest pyramids in Mexico. It is a colossal structure, but nothing less than what this emperor could command. Next week, we will discuss his succession, which, in a hilarious stroke of fate, his death is hidden for about 2 months while his successor tries to consolidate power. But after 3 years, we have large-scale rebellions all throughout the empire, and we will address those and the incoming Han when we reconvene. So, questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. If you want to talk, please raise your hand. Um, and while you're getting those questions ready, I'll tell you a little bit more about our group. We are History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. My name is Richard Sassoon. You've been watching Eastern Asian History, which is typically on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Today has been an off day, and we will return in 2 Thursdays from today. That is the 28th. And we will be discussing the Han Dynasty at that time. Jason has a presentation on Saturday. Jason?
Yeah, thank you for put the Asian philosophy there, but the time is wrong. It's 5 p.m. Eastern time.
5 p.m. Eastern time. Okay.
Yeah, not 7
And
p.m.
what will you be covering, Jason?
Oh, no, the same topic as you are doing for the tomorrow. Okay, but I'm not the presenter. We have another person present this one, and then we talk about Qin Dynasty, but more on the ancient texts and the cultural side. Okay, so
Yeah, wow.
that's for
No,
tomorrow.
so
Coincidence. We didn't plan on that. So
and Jason also wants to point out that Bayue does not include Taiwan. That's completely correct. The cultures of Taiwan are an Austronesian culture, so completely different linguistically, and a completely different society. Yeah. In fact, Taiwan would not really be incorporated into the Chinese sphere until midway through the 1600s. So that's yeah. So it's a very different sort of perspective on Taiwan and Taiwanese inclusion in Chinese history um, than with the perspective on South China, which is uniformly in the Chinese sphere from about 500 CE. By that point, it's pretty firmly Sinicized. Um, we also have, European Union security that Aaron and I address periodically. We have Jane Prendergast's Powerful Women series, and periodically we will address the current conflicts that are around the world. That's me and Aaron. So we also have our old series list, and you can see any of our old series. They're all up on the website. I personally encourage people to see the Dead Languages series, which goes through several of the languages of the Middle East. We've got the Greco-Roman civilization history, and all kinds of fun things as well. So, questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, if no other question, I just like to mention thank you very much, Richard, to give this kind of review, and then I really enjoy it, and I'm happy to see a different point of view. Okay, so but I just like to point out about the Qin Shi Huang. Traditionally, Qin Shi Huang, okay, has been viewed as a tyrant, a terrible person, based on the Confucian teaching. So through the history, all the Confucian scholars, they keep debating, okay, and talk about why Qin Shi Huang only lasts 15 years. The dynasty only lasts for 15 years because he did tyrant. He's not Confucianism. But in today's situation, you probably see more and more positive view about the Qin Shi Huang. And I believe that's because he can be viewed as just like you mentioned. I think it's a little bit strange, but I eventually agree, okay, or sort of agree. You put the legalism as kind of religion, because if you see one nation is the religion, okay, the common belief, then Qin Shi Huang really a good guy, if you put this point of view. Yeah, that's what I like to talk. Yeah.
I would agree with you that while Qin Shi Huang is somebody who, from a historical perspective, we can say, he founded the fundamental aspect of a unified China. And we can sort of say, in hindsight, it's probably positive that he did that. Otherwise, China would be all of these small divided kingdoms for a very long period of time. I completely agree that he was a tyrant in terms of how he treated his population, and I think I tried to make that quite clear between his burning of the scholars, his repression of the peasants, his attempts to the way he dealt with his own mother, the way he destroyed the city of Daliang, or rather permitted the destruction of Daliang because it was General Wang who did it. But um, and I think that it's one of those things where you can respect some of the achievements because of how long lasting they have been, such as the writing system. But at the same time, I think you really have to uh, you this is not the style of unification that we would hope for. So no, but I think that's a really good point. And the other point that you raise, and I think it's a really nice one, is that when the Han Dynasty comes to power, and the Han Dynasty becomes much more pro-Confucian, um, the Confucian scholars point out that the the li that sort of etiquette and the respect for these relationships and the benevolence, the ren, is just not there in the Qin state. And so a true imperial ruler should rule with the virtues that Confucianism would hold as valuable. And so that's how other Chinese empires have been judged. And of course, that puts the Qin dynasty in a negative light because, of course, he's not any of those things. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah. Again, I think it's about the Confucianism, Daoism, or uh, legalism. Okay, so one thing I'd like to make it a little bit clear is about Daoism, right? We should separate Daoism, philosophical Daoism, and religious Daoism. So when we talk about Laozi and the Zhuangzi, which we can consider as religious, but not religious, philosophical Daoism, okay, which talk about Wu Wei, and I constantly translate as non-action, okay, to the people, also to the emperor. So, but the religious Taoism, which a lot of deities worship, heaven, hell, sometimes mixed with Buddhism, which happens much later time, and we call it religious Taoism, and it's still very popular in places like Taiwan, okay, and some other country. So I think the concept that we probably need to separate these two things, and constantly being confused by the people outside this culture, even people inside the culture, still not get very clear about the difference between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism.
No, I think that's a very well taken point. Um, when I was talking about Taoism as a religion, and I was actually talking about what you define as philosophical Taoism, right? There is certainly the veneration cult of Taoism that begins to exist, and I think that that sort of folds into Shintoism and Buddhism, in that they already have certain types of ancestor worship, certain rites of meditation, and so those become folded into that sort of popularist Taoism. I think that's right. There's a comment here that uh, on the 30th of March at 2 to 4, it wasn't on the schedule of upcoming events, but for those who are interested, there will be a presentation on the ancient civilization of the Medes and Cyrus the Great, which is, of course, the history of Persia, um, roughly during the same time as the spring and autumn period. So, same period of time, just shifted a little bit to Persia. Um, yeah, because Cyrus the Great ruled in around the 500s BCE. There's a question here, and I think Jason would also be really great to opine on this. Um, to what degree is Sima Qian accurate for the period? Um, I would say I've had limited engagement with his texts. I've seen bits and pieces of them. I haven't read the whole thing 'cause he wrote a lot. Um, but I generally focused on his review of external affairs of China, primarily with the barbarian tribes. And with respect to what he writes about the barbarians, I would be inclined to say he's more accurate than pretty much any of the sources we have, other than the secret history of the Mongols, in terms of how he portrays the relationship between China and the barbarians, pointing out that at some points China was weaker than them and therefore was extorted by them. At some points, China was stronger than them and was able to defeat them. And so um, it's much more critical of China than a lot of other historians who tend to promote the idea that China was always superior to the barbarians. Jason?
Yeah, well, but different than you. I really enjoy reading Sima Qian the writing. Okay, but more that because I'm not that interested in the historical correctness. Okay, I'm more interested in the idea. So, Sima Qian's writing is very interesting. He, for example, how Qin Shi Huang looked like. Of course, we didn't. Nobody see him. Okay, but Sima Qian will have described. He's short. He's sound like wolf. Okay, and he has kind of the how do you call it? The chest is again up. Okay, and no neck. Okay, this kind of description. And he described the first emperor of Han Dynasty. He has a description how he looked like, and talk about when his mother sleep a country called a Liu lady, old grandma Liu, and sleep on the lakeside, have the dreaming, have the dragon making love to her, and then get pregnant. So he will write this kind of story, and I don't care it's correct or not correct. At least he keep a complete story, and he is at least the person the closest to the time. So in a way, in my section, philosophy or related here, I like to pull out the Sima Qian's so-called the record of the grand historian and read the original Chinese and translate to English because I find out it's interesting. Let's put it this way.
No, I really like that you brought out the story quality that he often does. Ironically, from a historian perspective, those sorts of personal stories and descriptions and things like that are the least historically verifiable. Doesn't mean they're inaccurate. We don't have any information to verify them. Um, Stories of and things that he wrote. The historically verifiable things tend to be larger imperial actions, like the empire went to war in this year, this person died in this year, um, this territory brought in this much grain in this year, um, things that have external validation. Um, so I would agree with Jason that for a person in his time period, he's probably more accurate than anybody else. Any other questions, comments, concerns? If that's the case, I think we can close this out. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.